The Galactic Confederation had spent roughly 3,000 years perfecting the art of bureaucratic superiority, and they were damn good at it. Every species had its place in the cosmic pecking order, meticulously catalogued and filed away in databases that would make a tax collector weep with joy. At the top sat the ethereals, beings so advanced they communicated through interpretive dance and considered solid matter beneath them. Below them, the Vorthans strutted about like peacocks, with superiority complexes and enough military hardware to glass a small moon. Then came the Quilnari, the Zephyrians, the Kethvar, and so on, each species neatly arranged in descending order of technological prowess and cultural sophistication. And way, way down at the bottom, somewhere between cosmic joke and biological curiosity, sat the humans. Deathworld, as they called them. The classification itself was meant to be intimidating, but the galactic community had turned it into something of a punchline. Oh yes, they came from a planet so ridiculously hostile that it would kill most civilized species within hours, but that just made them amusing oddities, like watching a particularly resilient bacterium survive in acid. Impressive in a crude sort of way, but hardly threatening to anyone with half a brain and a proper environmental suit. The irony was lost on approximately everyone in the galaxy, which was about to become relevant in the most spectacular way possible. Station Kepler-7 orbited a binary star system that served as a neutral meeting ground for diplomatic functions. It was one of those marvel of engineering affairs that the Confederation loved to build, all gleaming corridors and gravitational fields that somehow managed to accommodate 17 different atmospheric requirements simultaneously. The humans had contributed exactly nothing to its construction, which everyone agreed was probably for the best. Give a Deathworlder a wrench, and they'd probably try to weaponize it. Commander Zephy's Krell of the Vorthan Imperial Fleet had been stationed on Kepler-7 for 6 months, and he was thoroughly convinced that his assignment was punishment for some crime he couldn't remember committing. The Vorthans were a proud warrior race, standing nearly 3 meters tall, with chitinous exoskeletons that gleamed like polished obsidian. They'd conquered half their galaxy before joining the Confederation, and they'd never let anyone forget it. Krell embodied every stereotype of his species: arrogant, aggressive, and absolutely convinced that might made right. He'd been dealing with an increasing number of what he generously called incidents involving the station's human population. Not that there were many humans aboard, maybe 24 at most, all of them in menial positions that didn't require actual thinking: janitors, maintenance workers, food service drones. The kind of jobs that civilized species had automated centuries ago, but which humans seemed oddly suited for. Marcus Chen had been mopping floors on Kepler-7 for 8 months, and he was thoroughly convinced that his life had taken a turn for the surreal. Not that he was complaining. After 15 years in the Earth Defense Corps, cleaning up alien messes was refreshingly straightforward. No one shot at him, no one tried to blow him up, and the pay was decent enough to send home to his sister's kids on Mars. The other station personnel had grown accustomed to his presence, in that way civilized beings accommodate useful furniture. He was efficient, quiet, and had an uncanny ability to fix things that shouldn't have been fixable. The Quilnari engineers appreciated his knack for jury-rigging solutions to impossible problems. The Zephyrian administrators liked that he never complained about overtime. Even the Vorthans treated him with the sort of benign neglect usually reserved for houseplants. Marcus had served 3 tours on Europa during the Titan Rebellion, another 2 on the Martian frontier, and had been decorated for actions that remained classified even in his own personnel file. He spoke 7 languages fluently and could field strip a plasma rifle blindfolded. He'd killed more sentients than most species had words for, and he'd done it with tools that would have made a Stone Age savage proud. None of this appeared in his maintenance worker profile. To everyone on Kepler-7, Marcus Chen was just another harmless Deathworlder pushing his cleaning cart through the corridors and nodding politely when spoken to. The perfect invisible man in a universe that had forgotten humans could be dangerous. The diplomatic reception was supposed to be a simple affair, the Vorthans presenting their latest territorial expansion proposal to the Confederation Council. Standard procedure called for all non-essential personnel to remain in their quarters during such meetings, but life support systems had a habit of ignoring diplomatic protocols. When the atmospheric recycler in Section C started making sounds like a dying whale, someone had to fix it. Marcus had been elbow-deep in a filtration unit when the first delegation arrived. Through the maintenance hatch he could see Commander Krell directing his subordinates with the sort of theatrical authority that came naturally to his species. The Vorthans loved their ceremonies, their rigid hierarchies, their elaborate displays of dominance. It was all very impressive if you were into that sort of thing. The problem started when Marcus's tool cart decided to demonstrate the fundamental law of entropy by collapsing, just as Ambassador Queltz of the Ethereal Council was gliding past. The crash was magnificent. Wrenches and plasma cutters scattered across the polished floor like mechanical confetti, with Marcus diving after them in a display of reflexes that would have been impressive if anyone had been paying attention to the maintenance guy. He'd managed to gather most of his tools when Commander Krell's shadow fell across him. The Vorthan's voice carried the sort of barely controlled rage that suggested this was not his first frustrating experience today. "You incompetent primitive, look what you've done." Marcus looked up to see Ambassador Queltz floating serenely above the chaos, his ethereal form shimmering with what might have been amusement. The ethereals didn't actually have emotions in any conventional sense, but they found physical comedy universally entertaining. "Sorry about that," Marcus said, continuing to collect his scattered tools. "I'll have this cleaned up in just..." The slap came without warning. Commander Krell's massive hand struck Marcus across the face with enough force to send him sprawling across the deck. The sound echoed through the corridor like a gunshot, and suddenly the diplomatic reception had an audience. For a moment, the universe held its breath. Marcus lay there for exactly 1 second, his mind processing what had just happened. The pain was negligible, he'd been hit harder by his own drill sergeant, but the implications were crystal clear. In front of witnesses, in a diplomatic zone, an alien military commander had just struck a human being like he was disciplining a pet. The old Marcus, the one who'd signed up for maintenance work and quiet obscurity, would have probably apologized and slunk away. That Marcus had been trying very hard to forget 15 years of training that had turned him into something considerably more dangerous than a janitor. But muscle memory was a hell of a thing. Marcus rolled to his feet in one fluid motion, his hand closing around the plasma cutter he'd been reaching for. The tool was meant for cutting through hull plating, but it would work just fine on chitinous exoskeletons. His body moved with the economical precision of someone who had killed professionally, and his mind calculated angles and trajectories with the sort of cold efficiency that had made him legendary in certain military circles. Commander Krell had approximately 3 seconds to realize that he'd made a mistake of cosmic proportions. The human's eyes had changed, gone from the mild, slightly unfocused gaze of a menial worker to the flat, predatory stare of something that had crawled out of a Deathworld's deepest nightmares. This was the look that prey animals recognized on an instinctual level, the expression that said apex predator in a language older than civilization. The plasma cutter hummed to life with a sound like angry hornets. Marcus moved. 1 second. The plasma beam carved through the air in a perfect arc, trailing superheated particles like a comet's tail. Commander Krell's hand was still extended from the slap, his body language radiating arrogant authority. He was beginning to turn, maybe to address the crowd of witnesses, when the beam took his arm off at the shoulder. 2 seconds, the severed limb hit the deck with a wet thump that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Krell's scream was the sort of sound that would have made a banshee proud, high, keening, and absolutely terrified. He staggered backward, ichor streaming from the cauterized wound, his remaining hand scrabbling for the sidearm at his hip. 3 seconds, Marcus was already inside the Vorthan's reach, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years learning to kill things twice his size. The plasma cutter traced another arc, this one aimed considerably higher. Krell's hand had barely touched his weapon when the beam separated his head from his shoulders with surgical precision. 4 seconds, the head tumbled through the air with the lazy rotation of a ball tossed by a child. It hit the deck and rolled toward Ambassador Queltz, who regarded it with the sort of detached interest usually reserved for mildly amusing street performers. The body remained upright for another heartbeat, fountaining ichor across the polished floor, before collapsing in a heap of expensive armor and shattered dreams. 5 seconds. Marcus straightened, clicked off the plasma cutter and calmly returned it to his tool belt. He looked around the corridor at the assembled diplomats and dignitaries, all of whom appeared to be suffering from various degrees of shock-induced paralysis. His voice was perfectly conversational, like he was discussing the weather. "Sorry about the mess. I'll get this cleaned up." The silence that followed was the sort that physicists might study for its unique properties. It seemed to have actual weight. pressing down on the assembled beings like a physical force. Someone, probably one of the Quelnari delegates, was making small choking sounds. Ambassador Queltz continued to float serenely above the carnage, his ethereal form pulsing with what might have been approval. Dr. Vexter of the Zephyrian Science Council was the first to find his voice, though it came out as more of a squeak than actual words. That was a Vorthan battle commander. Was being the operative phrase, Marcus replied, pulling his cleaning supplies from the cart. Now he's a biohazard spill. The news spread through the station's communication network like wildfire through a ammunition depot. Within minutes, every species representative was receiving priority transmissions from their respective homeworlds. The Vorthans were demanding immediate retribution for the murder of their commander. The Quelnari were requesting detailed analysis of human combat capabilities. The Ethereals were asking for video recordings because they found the whole thing hilarious. Administrator Quilnox, a bureaucrat of the highest order, was faced with the sort of situation that didn't have a proper filing procedure. His species had spent centuries developing protocols for every conceivable diplomatic crisis. But Deathworlder janitor decapitates military commander during reception apparently hadn't made the list. This is unprecedented, he muttered, his tentacles writhing with nervous energy. There are procedures, protocols, proper channels for this sort of thing. Marcus continued mopping up the ichor, occasionally wringing out his cleaning cloth into a bucket with the sort of methodical efficiency that spoke of long practice. If it helps, I can file a maintenance report. Removed organic obstruction from diplomatic corridor. Recommend increased sanitation protocols for high-traffic areas. The crowd of witnesses had begun to disperse, though they moved with the sort of careful, deliberate steps of people who weren't entirely sure they were safe. The Vorthans had retreated to their quarters, presumably to contact their fleet and demand orbital bombardment. The other species were maintaining what they probably thought was a safe distance, though Marcus suspected they were overestimating their own running speed. Captain Thorne, the station's head of security, arrived 20 minutes later with a full tactical team. The Kelthran was known for his professional competence and his ability to handle delicate situations with appropriate force. He took one look at the scene, the blood, the cleaning supplies, the human calmly organizing his tools, and experienced what his species called cognitive displacement. "Chen," he said carefully, "I need you to put down the cleaning equipment and come with me." Marcus looked up from his bucket, his expression mildly curious. "Am I under arrest?" "That's complicated." Captain Thorne's security team had arranged themselves in a loose circle, their weapons drawn but not quite pointed at anyone in particular. "There are questions that need answering." "Sure." Marcus set down his mop and straightened. "Just let me finish cleaning up this mess first. Health and safety regulations, you know." The interrogation room was a study in psychological warfare, designed to make subjects feel isolated and vulnerable. The lighting was harsh, the furniture uncomfortable, and the walls were covered with sensors that could detect everything from elevated heart rate to pheromone emissions. It was the sort of room that had broken hardened criminals and diplomatic negotiators alike. Marcus sat in the provided chair and waited patiently for someone to ask him a question. The interrogation team consisted of representatives from 5 different species, each bringing their own expertise to the table. Dr. Vextar was there to provide psychological analysis. Commander Yilth represented Vorthan military interests. Administrator Quilnux was handling the bureaucratic angles. Captain Thorne was maintaining security, and floating above them all, Ambassador Queltz observed with the sort of detached interest that came from existing on a higher plane of consciousness. "Let's start with the basics," Dr. Vextar said, his voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone who studied dangerous animals for a living. "What is your full name and occupation?" "Marcus Chen, maintenance engineer, 2nd class," Marcus replied. "Employee identification number 7749, Delta Epsilon." "And your background prior to this assignment?" Marcus appeared to consider this for a moment. "I fix things." Commander Yilth leaned forward, his mandibles clicking with barely contained rage. "You murdered a superior officer." "I defended myself against an unprovoked assault," Marcus corrected. "There's a difference." "Ill slapped you." Yilth's voice rose to a near shriek. "It was a disciplinary action." "It was an assault," Marcus repeated calmly. "And I responded appropriately." Dr. Vextar was frantically reviewing something on his datapad, his eyes growing wider with each passing second. According to your personnel file, you have no military training whatsoever. You were hired as a civilian maintenance worker with basic technical qualifications. It's correct. Then how, the scientist's voice was strained, did you execute a perfect combat maneuver that would have challenged a trained Vorthan warrior? Marcus shrugged. I guess I'm a fast learner. The questions continued for 3 hours, each one revealing more about the cosmic joke that had just unfolded. Yes, Marcus had killed Commander Krell. Yes, he'd done it with a maintenance tool in front of 24 witnesses. Yes, he'd done it with the sort of casual efficiency that suggested extensive training. And no, he wasn't going to explain where that training had come from. The breakthrough came when Administrator Quillnox accessed the classified sections of Marcus's personnel file. The bureaucrat's complexion shifted through several colors that probably didn't have names, before settling on a shade that suggested imminent cardiac arrest. Gentlemen, he said quietly, I believe we have a problem. The file made for interesting reading. Marcus Chen, it turned out, had been considerably more than a maintenance worker in his previous career. The Earth Defense Corps had classified him as a Special Operations Specialist, which was military speak for extremely dangerous individual who kills people for a living. He'd been awarded the Solar Cross for actions during the Titan Rebellion, the Martian Campaign Medal for service on the frontier, and the Distinguished Service Order for classified operations that had apparently saved several colonies from extinction. He'd also been medically discharged after sustaining injuries that would have killed most humans, and had spent 2 years in rehabilitation learning to function in civilian society. The therapy had been successful, according to his medical records. He'd adapted well to peaceful employment and shown no signs of violent tendencies, until of course someone had slapped him in front of witnesses. This changes things, Captain Thorne said, his voice carrying the sort of careful neutrality that suggested he was reassessing his entire worldview. If Chen was acting in self-defense... Self-defense? Commander Yilth's voice cracked with indignation. He decapitated a superior officer with a plasma cutter. After being assaulted, Dr. Vextar pointed out, and his response was proportional to the threat level he perceived, from a human perspective at least. Ambassador Quelt spoke for the first time, his ethereal voice carrying harmonics that suggested vast amusement. The Confederation has spent 3 millennia cataloging species by their technological capabilities. We measure intelligence by computational power, civilization by engineering prowess, and threat level by military hardware. We never considered that the most dangerous species might be the one that learned to kill with rocks and sticks. The implications were staggering. If one human maintenance worker could kill a trained Vorthan commander without breaking a sweat, what did that say about the rest of their species? How many other civilians were walking around with the sort of combat training that would make a professional soldier nervous? The answer, as it turned out, was most of them. The emergency session of the Confederation Council convened 6 hours later, with representatives from every major species participating via quantum entanglement communicators. The debate was spirited. The humans must be reclassified immediately, insisted Premier Kothvar of the Zephian Union. They represent a clear and present danger to civilized society. They're janitors and maintenance workers, countered Admiral Vexgen of the Quilnari fleet. How dangerous can they be? Some of their janitors just killed a Vorthan battle commander with a tool meant for cutting metal, Premier Kothvar replied. I'd say that qualifies as significantly dangerous. The debate continued for hours, with each species trying to understand how they'd so completely misunderstood the threat level posed by humanity. The humans had been peaceful, cooperative, and seemingly harmless. They'd integrated into galactic society without causing any major incidents. They'd taken the lowest-paying jobs and the most dangerous assignments without complaint. And apparently, they'd been treating the entire galaxy as a vacation from their natural state of controlled violence. The final decision was unanimous. Humans would be reclassified as a Category 5 threat species, with all the diplomatic protections and military considerations that entailed. No more menial labor assignments, no more being treated as cosmic jokes, and definitely no more slapping. Marcus Chen was released from custody with a formal apology and a promotion to Chief of Maintenance Operations. He accepted both, with the sort of gracious professionalism that suggested he'd been expecting the outcome all along. As he walked back to his quarters, pushing his cleaning cart through corridors that suddenly seemed a lot more respectful, Marcus reflected on the irony of the situation. The galaxy had spent 3,000 years building a civilization based on technological superiority and bureaucratic efficiency. They'd forgotten that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the universe was a species that had learned to survive without either. Behind him, the diplomatic reception continued with a notably more civilized tone. The Vorthans were being unusually polite to the service staff, the Quelnari were saying please and thank you to the humans in food service, and Ambassador Queltz was floating serenely above it all, radiating the sort of cosmic amusement that came from watching an entire galaxy suddenly realize they'd been living next to a species of barely domesticated apex predators. The janitor had spoken, and the universe had listened. It was, Marcus thought as he returned to his quarters, going to make the next performance review very interesting indeed.